Imagine getting arrested for having a child with a dead body. Jennifer Burrows is a 26-year-old who was working at a morgue when she was arrested after a DNA test proved her child's father was a dead body she was supposed to autopsy. But it actually gets worse from here, because while Jennifer was working as an assistant pathologist at the morgue, she had relations with more than 60 bodies, belonging to men aged 17 to 71 years old. She did this for 2 years until it led to the birth of her son. Her son's father was a 57-year-old veterinarian from Texas, who passed away in a car accident in 2017. Jennifer was charged with 158 counts of indecent treatment of a corpse. Many psychologists and experts have debated why someone would do this. The reasons range from curiosity to severe mental illness. Some even believe Jennifer was suffering from psychosis. Alright, after all that, I don't really know how to end this video, so stay safe out there and follow for more.
This woman died after they injected chicken noodle soup into her veins. The woman pictured behind me is Ilda Maciel of Brazil. Apparently one of the nurses injected chicken noodle soup into her veins instead of a feeding tube. I really don't know how you can mess it up that bad, but somehow somebody did it. This woman was 88 years old. It's noted that she started to squirm and stick her tongue out after the chicken noodle soup was injected into her. Her daughter reported she had never seen her mother in such excruciating pain, and Maciel died just 12 hours after the chicken noodle soup was injected into her body. This happened in 2012 and the family ended up suing them. The hospital CEO admitted this was wrong but takes no fault in the patient's death. Now that is just crazy. She got a pulmonary embolism shortly after it was injected into her and they believe that's the cause of death. This happened back in 2012. I can't find any information regarding the lawsuit. So if you guys have any information on if the family won or if they lost, please let me know in the comment section. Very unfortunate and sad story for this elderly woman. What do you guys think about this story and what would you do in this situation?
A Barbie left on the grave of this murdered child might be used to solve her cold case. 6-year-old Rosie Tapia was abducted from her bedroom on August 13, 1995. Her mother had gotten home at 3 a.m. and checked on Rosie in the bedroom that she shared with her siblings. They were all sleeping soundly with the window open, and her mother went to close the window but didn't lock it because the noise would wake the children. Literally just 2 hours later, her mom woke up and got a feeling that she needed to check on her children. Rosie was gone and her body was later found floating in the nearby canal. Police determined that the screen had been pried off from the outside, and being so low to the ground, an intruder could easily get in. And unfortunately, any DNA on her body was contaminated by the canal water. And after Rosie was buried, the family found a single Barbie doll sitting on her grave. And police are hoping that DNA from the doll could be used to solve the case. Advances in DNA technology give hope that one day Rosie's case can be solved, and over 60 people have been swabbed, but no one's been arrested. There are multiple suspects in this case, including a man that was seen walking with wet jeans on the morning of Rosie's death, and this man in the hat and sunglasses that carried Rosie back to her apartment after she hurt herself on the playground the day before she died. I do a deep dive into possible suspects and theories on the murder of Rosie Tapia on my YouTube channel, Celestial Sylvia.
This woman created such disturbing videos that she was sentenced to 50 years in prison. This story is truly one of the worst things that I've ever covered here on TikTok, so if you have a weak stomach or you can't hear about animal cruelty, please keep scrolling. So this is Ashley Richards from Houston, Texas. In 2015, she pleaded guilty to 4 counts of producing and 1 count of distributing these disturbing videos. And once again, I'm going to warn you, you can keep scrolling at any time before we get into these details. So this all started in 2012 when PETA, or the group known as People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, contacted the Houston police about a video they had found online. This film was titled Ebony Kill Cat, and it depicted extremely sadistic and cruel acts being forced upon a kitten. So the police got into contact with the people from PETA, and they then sent them 20 additional videos. These videos depicted the sadistic torture of various animals, including kittens, a fish, pigeon, crayfish, mice, a rabbit, all being tortured with different things like high heels, knives, screwdrivers, and pliers. In the videos, the woman that appeared in them was wearing a Mardi Gras style mask, and she would talk suggestively to the people watching this torture. Yes, that meant that there were paying customers out there that were paying this woman to produce these absolutely horrific videos. I cannot share the details of some of these videos. You can actually find the information online through news articles, but I mean, I think I changed as a person after reading these articles. Eventually, though, the police were able to track Ashley's IP address, which led them to her suburban home in Houston. This is an example of one of the messages she shared with the client. I mean, just, ugh. That led them to Brent Justice and Ashley Richards. These were the two that were producing these videos and selling them on a website online. And Congress had recently passed a bill making this specific type of video material, otherwise known as crush, illegal. So thankfully they were arrested. Shockingly though, Brent Justice, after the trial, he was actually sentenced to 50 years in prison. Shockingly though, Ashley, the woman who actually carried out these acts on camera, was only sentenced to 10 years in prison. Now, personally, this is one of the most disturbing things I've ever read about, and I definitely think she should have been in prison for a lot longer, but that's the justice system.
Molly Kendall has really creepy stories about what it was like living with Ted Bundy. Her mom, Liz Kendall, dated Ted Bundy for 6 years while he was actively killing people. She remembers him being a very involved parental figure, but he also may have been grooming her. They would play games around the house while her mother was at work. But one night they were playing hide and seek, and she said she saw the outline of him underneath the blanket. So she pulled the blanket off, revealing a naked Ted. She was shocked and asked what he was doing. Ted told her that he could turn invisible, but his clothes couldn't, so he had to be naked so that she wouldn't see him. As part of the game, they had to run back to home base, which again, Ted is fully nude. During this, Ted fell down, and his member was hard. She didn't know anything about male anatomy because she was just 7, and she asked him if it hurt, and he replied it didn't hurt, but Molly said there was a noticeable change in his eye. She then said she was tired and wanted to go to sleep, but he insisted on reading her a bedtime story, and that's when she noticed the sheet was all wet. As for what she's publicly spoken about, this is all that happened. She said that at the time she didn't tell anyone because she didn't want to hurt her mom, and she assumed that Ted had just gotten too carried away with the game. And the last story I'm going to tell is that 2 times Molly said she saw the dead look that Ted would get in his eyes that his survivors described before they escaped his crimes. Twice they were out swimming, and there was a raft that Molly was using to hang onto, but Ted kept pushing the raft out of her reach. He stood there just watching her as the child grew tired of treading water, and then he would bring the raft closer, she would reach out, and then he would pull it away again. And this went on for several minutes until he eventually gave the raft back. Molly and Liz were originally in hiding, but they have come forward, and they're the subject of the documentary on Amazon Prime called Ted Bundy Falling for a Killer. It's interesting that they both dyed their hair and cut it short when Ted was known to go for brunettes with long brown hair parted down the middle. If you learned something new, like this video and let me know in the comments, and follow for more.
The case of the Dardeen family was one that was deemed too gruesome for news stations and daytime television shows such as Oprah, and to this day, nearly 25 years later, it still remains unsolved. The family consisted of 29-year-old Russell Keith, wife Ruby Elaine, who was 30 and 7 months pregnant at the time, and their 3-year-old son, who they had named Peter. The growing family had recently moved to the small town of Ina, Illinois in 1986 and were living in a rented-out trailer near Route 37, and though this was a small town, it did not have a reputation for being the safest. During the past 2 years, this small town had experienced 15 homicides, including that of a 10-year-old girl that had recently been murdered in the area. This had left everyone in the town, including the Dardeens, on edge, and in fact, when a woman had approached the trailer asking for help one night, Keith would flat out deny her and ask her to leave the property. The family had felt so unsafe here that Keith had told his mother, Joanne Dardeen, that regardless if he had a job lined up or not, he and the family would be moving out of the small town by the end of the year. But then came the night of November 17th, 1987. Keith, who had always been described as a reliable worker, had failed to show up to work that night, and after workers and family had failed to reach either him or Elaine, they decided to contact the police. Keith's father had agreed to meet with officials at the Dardeen residence, unaware of the horrors that they were about to discover. There is a major trigger warning for the rest of this episode, but once Keith's father and officials had made their way into the household, they would discover 3 bodies that were tucked inside Keith and Elaine's bed. The bodies had belonged to that of Elaine, their 3-year-old son Peter, and the newborn infant that Elaine had given birth to during the attack. All had been found deceased in the bed. Keith's body was nowhere to be found within the house, and much to the shock of the family, this led investigators to believe him to be the prime suspect in this case. But that theory would be put to rest when just the very next day, a group of hunters would find Keith Dardeen's body about a mile away from their trailer. He had been found, shot 3 times, and then sexually mutilated. His car would also later be found right in front of the police department in that town. The town immediately began to swirl with rumors as over 30 detectives had to chase down over 1,000 leads, but unfortunately those leads really came to nothing. There was no sign of an affair, drug use or drug selling, or any type of gambling debt that the family could have had, and this went on for years until one solid lead came up, which I'll have to make in a part 2.
This is one of the most wild true crime stories I have ever heard, and it seems like all of the news outside of TikTok is just ignoring it. So the 3 men you see behind me are named Ricky Johnson, David Harrington, and Clayton McGinney. And all 3 of them have 2 things in common. One of those things is this man, Jordan Willis, and the other thing is they were all found at Jordan Willis's house, no longer alive. You see, all 3 of these men went to their friend Jordan's house to watch the Kansas City Chiefs game, and then 3 days later, they were discovered still at Jordan's house, with all 3 of them no longer being alive. Now, if you thought that was weird, just wait, because it keeps getting weirder from here. Friends of the men allegedly called Jordan's house to try and get an answer and figure out where the men were, but nobody answered the phone. One of the friends' fiancés also apparently went to the house to knock and try and figure out where their fiancé was, but there was no answer, so the fiancé decided to break into the basement of the house and eventually discovered a body on the back porch of the house. Police were called shortly after this discovery, and they apparently discovered 2 more bodies in the backyard. And yes, it was these 3 men that were found deceased. Now, to make this even more wild, Jordan, who is still alive by the way, has not only not been charged with anything, but he's also apparently moving out of the house right now, as there was recently a U-Haul spotted in front of his house. According to police, there is no obvious signs of foul play, and investigators are still currently waiting for the medical examiner's report. Police are also apparently waiting on a search warrant so they can search Jordan's house. Now, according to the mother of David Harrington, who is one of the men that were found deceased, Jordan allegedly told the police that his friends froze and passed away, which is very odd for 3 people to just freeze outside of a house. It doesn't make any sense. Now, I'll be sure to update y'all and give more coverage to this story, since it seems like many news outlets are not wanting to cover it for whatever reason.
This is why parents should be watching who their children are talking to online. This is 13-year-old Patricia Alatorre, and she was born on May 14th of 2007 from Bakersfield, California. 26-year-old Armando Cruz started messaging Patricia through social media, and that's when they started to share explicit photos of themselves to each other. The 2 eventually met up together, and that is when Armando convinced Patricia to perform oral on him. A few days later, Patricia tried to ignore him, but Armando had threatened to post her private photos online. On July 1st of 2020, around 11 p.m., Patricia left her home and entered this white pickup truck, which was captured on camera. The truck belonged to Armando, and he drove around the area with Patricia while she was screaming that she did not want to go with him. Armando then forced himself onto her, SA'd her, and strangled her to death. Armando then had sex with her deceased body before placing her in a sleeping bag and setting her on fire in a parking lot. Her family had reported her as missing, but her case was treated as a runaway case. Since Armando's truck was caught on camera, he was later tracked down and arrested on July 6th. On July 7th, Kern County District Attorney had filed 12 felony charges against Armando. Armando pled guilty to all 12 felony charges and was sentenced to life in prison.
This is one of the most disgusting and evil cases I've heard of recently. On the 7th of December 2017, teacher Thelma Boinville was desperately trying to make some extra money. She was doing a cleaning job to earn extra money for her family, and the job suited her as her 8-year-old could come along and play while she worked. This was really handy as it meant she didn't have to fork out for childcare. She set out cleaning some holiday homes on the day in question, and her daughter waited in the car. The spot was a lovely scenic place called Kelky Beach. However, instead of walking in on a normal holiday rental to clean, she walked into a nightmare. Stephen Brown and his girlfriend Haley Dangerand were in the middle of robbing the place. They were scouring through drawers and wardrobes, hunting for valuables to steal. With Thelma walking in, their plan had been foiled. They decided they needed to dispose of their only witness. The evil pair tied up the mother, whose daughter waited unsuspectingly in the car outside. They used a machete, a knife, and a hammer to murder the innocent woman. But the horror was far from over. They exited the holiday home and came across Thelma's young daughter waiting in the car. They callously told the young girl, "We killed your mum," and then bound her up and gagged her. Sickeningly, they then took the 8-year-old into the home where they'd killed her mum and left her there tied up. The 2 Australian tourists who were renting the holiday home then came back and found the crime scene. The two killers were tracked down hours later in Thelma's car, which they'd stolen and driven off in. Haley was actually wearing her victim's earrings at the time. They actually begged for the officers to just shoot them and end their lives, but they wouldn't get away that easily. Thelma's husband, Kevin, wasn't actually allowed to see his wife's body due to the extent of her injuries. The autopsy revealed that she'd fought for her life, with many defensive wounds indicating a struggle. Since the murder, Stephen and Haley have both tried to blame each other. Stephen was found guilty of second-degree murder and apparently showed no emotion as the verdict was read out. Haley is currently awaiting trial.